Hello again. In the video this morning, I mentioned that one of the questions which we might profitably ask is why every winter the National Health Service in Britain struggles more and more to cope with the ordinary demands upon it, things like outbreaks of influenza. Why are mortuaries overflowing not just this year, but almost every year in the winter? Why are we running out of beds in intensive care? Can't the NHS plan for the fact that lots of old people fall ill with respiratory diseases in the winter? Maybe we should give them more money. Is it a funding crisis? This question is tied in with others, such as why it has in recent years become almost impossible in some places to book an appointment to see a general practitioner or find an NHS dentist or get a place for a child at the school of your choice. The truly weird thing about this particular question is that almost everybody in the country knows the answer to the question, and yet there is a conspiracy of silence which dictates that we must never speak it out loud or print the information in newspapers or magazines. It's like the emperor's new clothes, with nobody liking to point out what is so obviously happening. However, at risk of causing offence, I shall now say out loud what everybody else knows but apparently dares not say. At one time in Britain, the increase in population in any city or town was due to what is known as natural increase. This means that the number of babies being born was slightly higher than the number of people dying. This increase in population is a steady and slow process, and for most part of the country's history it was slow enough that it was possible to plan years ahead and work out how many schools or doctors would be needed in a particular district, and then calculate how many would then be needed in 10 or 20 years' time. This worked very well for most of the 20th century, 19th century, as far back as you care to look, really. Let's look at what has happened in the last 25 or 30 years, though. In 1990, fewer than 7 million people lived in London. The population of the city was declining. In 1960, over 8 million people lived there. All the long-term planning for future decades was predicated on either a stable population for London or one which might fall a little. Guess what? The population for London is now over 9 million. It has risen about 50% since 1990. Nobody planned for this. Nobody expected it. It is not natural increase at all. If that were the case, we would have seen a decline in the numbers living in the city. What does this mean for mortuaries and intensive care beds? It means that if a mortuary in a certain London district was coping easily with 10 corpses a week in 1990, then it is now expected to cope with 15. This is why we are seeing the use of refrigerated lorries as temporary morgues. The same goes for hospital beds. We have not built 50% more hospitals than we had in 1990, so all those new people will have to be crammed into the hospitals we have. The same applies to GPs, dentists and schools. The problem here is not a funding problem. Giving a hospital more money will not enable them to deal with all those new patients. They might build a new wing, but the population is shooting up so rapidly that by the time that wing is built, there will already be a need for another 2 new wings. According to the United Nations projections, there will be another 1 million people crammed into London 10 years from now. So at the moment there's about 9.5, there'll probably be 10.5 in a decade's time. If the mortuaries and hospitals are stretched now, wait until you see what it's like in 2030. I provide a link in the description to this video for the population of London, both historically and as projected in the future. Of course, this is not only happening in London. The same applies to Birmingham and Nottingham, Leicester and Manchester. Even small towns are seeing huge rises in population which are putting pressure on services of all kinds. This then is the real reason for the inability of the NHS to cope. Although nobody dare say it out loud, this is a problem caused entirely by unrestricted immigration.